Welcome to the NC DWI Guy Podcast, where defenders of the Constitution assemble to prepare for courtroom battle and firm owners gather to develop marketing strategies that will revolutionize the practice of criminal defense. Here's your host, the NC DWI Guy, Jake Minnick.
Hello, fellow freedom fighters, and welcome to another episode of the NC DWI Guy. Today we have with us Jacob Harding, who is the Regional Program Development Coordinator for ALCOLOCK USA. So we're going to be spending a lot of time today talking about Ignition Interlock systems, fails from those systems, what happens when you get that notification letter from the DMV, what is your next step? So for all of us, going to be a very helpful subject to talk about. Jacob, very excited to have you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, tell us, I guess, just a little bit in terms of your role with ALCOLOCK. What does that look like in terms of management, and just tell us a little bit about ALCOLOCK itself.
Okay, so ALCOLOCK is an Ignition Interlock provider. We're actually based out of Canada. Alcohol Countermeasure Systems is our parent company per se. They started out as a manufacturing company. They created the fuel cells that a lot of the other Ignition Interlock providers were using. Monotech for a long time, they were buying their fuel cells from ACS there in Canada. They've been around since the early 90s. And then they got into the actual operational side of doing things, providing the direct services. So my role is connecting with attorneys, treatment providers. That's how it is in North Carolina, and then all the states along the Eastern Seaboard. And each state is so much different as far as how they handle their Ignition Interlock program. So in other states, I would be connecting more with state officials, probation, and things of the such.
Great. Well, yeah, I think in terms of just kind of maybe starting the conversation on the interlock front, in terms of the initial appointment for somebody coming in to get a interlock device installed on their vehicle, whether that's the result of a license reinstatement, whether that's a result of a recent DWI conviction, tell us a little bit about what that looks like. How long does it take for that kind of initial appointment? What should a person bring with them to the installation appointment? Just tell us a little bit about what that initial appointment looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So with us, you honestly really only need to have some kind of photo ID and then the vehicle registration or proof of purchase, something of the sort.
So no court documents are required?
No, so we don't require that you bring in any court documents. It causes a lot of confusion because the DMV will send out a letter 2 weeks after someone is convicted of that DWI. Right. So people have this letter from the DMV, and that letter from the DMV is going to state what their BAC restriction should be once they transition over to a DMV authority, I guess, not a court with the limited driving privilege. So we don't require any of those documents simply because what's on the DMV letter is not necessarily correct when they have a limited driving privilege, and it causes a lot of confusion. So when they come in, that's really all that we have to have. Our call center, and then me personally, like I do all their educational training, they're very aware of when someone would be eligible for it. So the first thing we'll ask is, when were you convicted? And then based on that statement, that's going to let us know, okay, they're going to be eligible in 45 days from whatever that day is, or if it's been 2 years since they were convicted, okay, the DMV is probably their monitoring authority, and we kind of handle it from there.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then whenever they come in, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to go into like what happens whenever they come in.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
So the whole process itself takes about 2 hours. And about 1 hour and 15 minutes of that is actually installing the device into the vehicle. The other 45 minutes is training, and that's really, really important. No matter who your interlock provider is, like who you decide to use, you really need to be aware of like what they're giving the clients and what kind of training they're doing. We have 2 booklets that we give clients. One is North Carolina specific, and then one is just on the technical side of how the device works. You really want to make sure they have a state-specific guidebook before they leave. And it's a requirement through the DMV. Anyone who has clients who are using interlock providers, the North Carolina DMV requirements that we are required to do. So giving people booklets, doing the training, what training we have to do, that's all public information. And it's really good information for attorneys to be aware of. So hey, look, this is what you're supposed to be giving my clients. So if they do have a hearing or whatever it may be, you need to verify that they were trained on these things before they're just sent off into the world with this weird device in their car. And that can be found just as a simple Google search, really good thing to be aware of. So they'll do that training. We'll work on blowing. They blow 3 times. They have to pass 3 times before we'll install it. And then we'll go through that hour process of installing it in there.
That's great. And in terms of the kind of training about the use of the device, do you all spend time kind of talking about specifically kind of what to do each time that the vehicle is turned on, and kind of the run through of what, the proper procedures are for the using the device as they're driving?
We do. So there's a video, a training video that we have everybody watch, and it can be found on YouTube, ALCOLOCK LR training video. And then every attorney would be able to see exactly what their client is seeing.
We'll put a link in the show notes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then we also have a checklist, and it's an NC DMV checklist that all interlock providers are required to have clients sign. And it'll go over step-by-step instructions. And that's more so for what happens if you get a violation. But if you have an interlock provider that you're using, you really should have a copy of that checklist. That way you can ask your clients, like, hey, like, were you told about this? Were you told about that? It's just good stuff to have. But yeah, we go over, when you get in your car, you have to blow. You have to take a test within 5 minutes. If you put your key in the ignition, otherwise it's going to cause what's called a battery fail at that point.
And when you say put your key in the ignition, so even before you turn the engine on, if you just kind of start the electrical
yes.
system. Okay.
So our device is tapped into the constant, the starter, or we cut the starter wire, but we tap into the horn, the lights, the ignition, the constant, the tach, and then we ground it out. And that constant is always pulling power. But whenever you stick your key in the ignition, the vehicle automatically sends power down that ignition wire. And that's kind of what lets the device know, hey, someone's about to take a test. And on our device, it'll go into what's called a sleep mode. That way it pulls less power when they're not in the vehicle. Okay. Whenever you stick the key in the ignition, that's kind of what makes it light up and say, okay, like now someone's about to get in it. But it can cause issues if you don't train someone properly and let them know, hey, if you stick your key in the ignition, you have 5 minutes to take a test. If you don't take one, it's going to cause this recall, and you're going to have to come back within 5 days. And that's why, again, training is so important, and having those state-specific booklets.
And in terms of the kind of constant that is pulling from the battery, I've had clients that have asked in the past about how this device is going to impact their vehicle's battery. Is there any kind of best practices or suggestions on that front? Do people need to have like a new battery installed prior to getting the interlock device installed? Do you all check the battery before installing it and say, hey, maybe this is something to consider? What does that look like in terms of the battery pull?
So when it's pulling from that constant, like I said, it is always pulling power. It's 8 millivolts of power per hour. So it's very similar to if you've ever seen someone with an aftermarket alarm system in their vehicle, and they'll have a little red LED light that is kind of shining. It pulls about that amount of power. Okay. So I don't say that people have to have a brand new battery. I mean, it's good, but it's really not needed. What's important is that your battery is putting out 12 volts of power. And that is something that we'll check when you first come in to make sure that the battery is okay. But even if your battery isn't brand new and it's not giving out exactly 12 volts, it is best practice to go out and start your car just once a week. The DMV only requires that you bring it to our shop every 2 months, every 60 days. So if you don't want to drive, you only want to drive it every 60 days, that's completely okay. The DMV cannot give you a violation for that like they can in other states. But going out once a week is a good idea for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to get your battery going, get your alternator going, and kind of keep those juices flowing. Two, the DMV doesn't require that you only drive it every 2 months, but let's say during that every 2-month trip, something happens, you get a couple fails, and you do get called in for a hearing. They won't call you in for a hearing for not driving it only but every 2 months. But if you get called in for another reason, they're going to kind of give you a hard time for only driving it every 2 months, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And yeah, in terms of the battery again, is it something that you should turn your vehicle on every certain amount of days in order to make sure that you don't have battery failure? Or is that kind of vehicle dependent? Is there any kind of time frame for that?
I usually say once a week.
Okay.
People who go out and will just once a week blow into it and crank the vehicle. I've never had anyone who has issues beyond that.
Okay.
What it can do is, because it is pulling power constantly, if there's already a problem, a lot of times with the alternator, it'll exacerbate those problems. Just kind of speed it up because it's something that's always pulling power. But that would be the same if someone had an aftermarket alarm that was always pulling a little bit of power. So it's not interlock specific. It's just anything that's constantly pulling power.
Okay, gotcha. Well, probably in terms of like the biggest question that we get from anybody client-wise about the interlock system, it's always, I've heard that, pizza can cause an interlock fail, or, whatever it might be, food-wise, beverage-wise, breath mint, mouthwash, what are the kind of general food categories that can cause that, or maybe most common food categories? And then in terms of information that you all provide to the client, what does that look like in terms of foreign substances education?
That's a great topic because we see it a lot.
I bet you guys do.
We do. So every other state in the country, and I like to start out with this, there's only a couple jurisdictions in other states where they have 0.00 BAC settings. North Carolina is very unique in the fact that we have like the entire state is 0.00, unless you're like a one-time DWI offender in 7 years and the DMV is your monitoring authority and you're 0.04. And the reason these other states set everyone at 0.025 is not so that people can just drink 1 or 2 beers and get in their car. It's so that people don't get these topical fail violations.
Right.
Because it's going to happen on any device that uses a fuel cell, whether it's the PBT that you blow onto when you first get pulled over, or this device. And it's any product that's going to have alcohol in it, or alcohol is going to be a byproduct of it. And the biggest one that we run into is bread. And I'll go over this list. And this isn't to say you can't use these products while you drive. I tell clients all the time, you can use it while you drive, just rinse with water before every test. And I'll get to that in a second. But bread has yeast and sugar in it. And if we took those two products and put them in a bowl, they wouldn't spontaneously ferment. But once they go in our mouth, we have an enzyme called amylase in our saliva. And amylase, it just breaks starches down to a smaller molecule, and it causes that fermentation in real time in your mouth. So every time you eat bread, the same way that beer is made, it's occurring right there in your mouth. But it's an almost negligible amount. But the way fuel cells work, in order to convert breath alcohol content to blood alcohol content, it has to essentially multiply that concentration by about 2,000. So if you have that product sitting directly in your mouth and you blow it into the unit, it's going to multiply it, and it's going to seem like more than it really is per se. So it's really detecting alcohol. It's not a false positive in a sense that it's not actually detecting alcohol. It's just not from the manner that we would normally think of. Fruit is another big one, and fruit flavorings. So they have fructose, citric acid, and ethylene gas. That's what causes that fermentation. So you can't rinse your mouth out with Mountain Dew. You have to rinse it out with water. Really, really important before the test. I tell clients, get a case of water and just put it in the back of your car. It's the single most important thing that we could tell anybody. Make sure you're rinsing with water. Products that have vanilla in it, vanilla extract has about 60% alcohol if you look at it. I've seen as high as a 0.05 from a honey bun. For whatever reason, honey buns are the worst. So
that is funny. I've definitely heard one of the
those.
DMV hearing officers in our area talk about honey buns and kind of like what's happening in the packaging and sitting around for a long period of time before it's purchased and consumed. He definitely referenced the honey bun as being one of the major issues.
The honey bun. Yeah. I don't know what it is, but it gives people problems. A big one is anything designed to freshen your breath. So toothpaste, mouthwash, minty gum. Even if it's alcohol free, it's still going to have sugar alcohol in there. It has to have something in it to kill the bacteria in your mouth. That's how those products work. And this doesn't mean don't have clients not brush their teeth. I'd rather them brush their teeth before they come see us. They just need to drink some water after they do. The only product that I suggest that you wait about 5 to 10 minutes from the time you use it to the time you blow into an interlock is mouthwash. And that's because mouthwash soaks into our gums a little bit. So in the morning, rather than brush your teeth, use mouthwash right before you go out of the door, make it one of the first things that you do. And then the last big one is anything that ends in OL is a type of alcohol. So technically menthol, Lysol, propylene glycol. So we say rinse with water and take 2 deep breaths before every test. That way, if you inhaled any alcohol, so cologne, perfume, aerosols have a really high alcohol content. It's what those products use to disperse the scents into the air. And we just want you to take a deep breath, like crack your window, take a deep breath, and exhale those products into the atmosphere before you blow them into the unit. The DMV is very aware of all of these things. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind whenever we're looking at log reports. We'll get to that in a second. Those are the big products that we try to tell people to avoid.
Great. And yeah, I guess kind of moving from that arena into kind of what happens if you do experience a fail. What should you do? What if you get the device telling you there is a kind of report of alcohol in the breath? What should be kind of the next steps? I mean, there's probably some that are mandatory in terms of getting the vehicle serviced, but what should be kind of the next steps to expect?
So on the client end of things, the first step would be to write down the time, the date, and whatever was happening whenever that violation occurred. Like we were talking about before you started recording, is having notes and documentation is so important because it could be 8, 9, 10 months later before the DMV finally sends out a form for the hearing. So people, when you walk into the hearing and you say, I don't know, it was 10 months ago, I don't remember what I had, for breakfast yesterday. I especially wouldn't know what happened 10 months ago. So if you go in and you just don't know what happened and you tell that to the hearing officer, that usually not too receptive to it. But if you know the date, the time, that you had a honey bun for breakfast that day, and then it caused that fail, that's really the only proof, that you're going to have. Now, when a fail
I think
does
just
occur,
like keeping the case of water in the vehicle, another kind of thing to keep in the vehicle is just like a notepad, a small notepad with a pen to document anything that is unusual about, a device reading, about a message that you're getting from the device, anything that is kind of an unusual event, just immediately documenting that, but having the ease of access to do that. So, that's something that I tell clients to do is to get a notepad and a pen and just put that near the driver's seat so that they can have that ready to go if anything comes up from the device.
Exactly. And then after that fail occurs, anytime a fail occurs, 5 minutes later, they're going to take another test. That's called the verification test. If someone's actually been drinking, they have a true BAC concentration, you're not going to pass in 5 minutes. Your body's not going to metabolize it in 5 minutes. And that's the point of that 5-minute test. So topical alcohols, they dissipate within seconds. I have a demo unit and I'll do presentations, all across the state, and I'll eat something and I'll blow a fail. And then 5 minutes later, I'll pass. I tell people all the time that, that's really the most important thing that you can do in that moment is make sure you take that second test 5 minutes later and pass it. So if you were to blow a fail, drink some water, step out of your car if you can, if you have the ability to, take a few deep breaths and take another test 5 minutes later. If you don't take that second test, there's really no proof that you have in your corner that you hadn't actually been drinking. That's the only proof that you have. The DMV is not a courtroom. You don't have to prove it beyond a benefit of the doubt. The DMV has a lot of authority in that matter. So taking that test is so important.
I think that's a really important point, and something that we could all kind of utilize in our practices of telling clients, look, if you do have a fail and you believe it's related to some sort of a foreign substance, something that you ate, something, a mouthwash that you just had, don't be so freaked out by the fact that you got a fail that you just turn the car off and then leave it for, 3 or 4 hours or longer. That is a good point, and something that I've been able to argue in hearings in the past is, 5 minutes later, there was a pass. So whatever caused this, violation in the first place was, clearly not consumption of some quantity of alcohol. Again, you're saying that there is alcohol in these things in very minuscule amounts, but clearly not, drinking alcohol.
What's funny is, I don't know if you've ever seen the DMV hearing form that your clients have to submit for a hearing. It's the F001 form. On that form, about a year ago, there used to be a section that said like a Ignition Interlock hearing violation, and there was a separate subsection, and it said topical violation. Right. And it was a cheaper hearing than it would be for a normal one. So the DMV knows that this occurs. But again, that's beyond me either.
That's interesting. It's also interesting because
it's not there anymore, though.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing that on the form that I've looked at most recently. But that it almost seems like an easy way to get like an admission of guilt from somebody if they check the wrong box. It's kind of like if you're checking the actual violation box, that's like an easy way to get an admission. So I wonder if that might have played into it as well. I don't recall seeing that topical violation.
I just remember it was cheaper. It was only $70 for that one, which
Interesting.
Was still odd. Like, why would you call someone for a hearing if that it's a topical fail?
Right, exactly.
It was cheaper for that than it was for the normal one, but now they got rid of that and it's just the one section. So it was a little odd. Just worth mentioning, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting.
Sorry.
Yes. So in terms of kind of like following that fail, what happens then? Take that second test and make sure that you're kind of doing everything that you can. What other kind of following best practices are there following a fail notification, or what are the next steps then in terms of your Ignition Interlock provider?
So as soon as you fail a test, anytime in North Carolina, we're what's called a one violation state. So anytime a violation, alleged violation, a recall, as we would say internally, is you have to bring it back to the service provider within 5 days. It doesn't matter if you passed 5 minutes later. A lot of states, most states, are what's called a 3 violation state, where you don't have to bring it back in to get it serviced until you have 3 violations in a row. Not that way in North Carolina. So even if you pass 5 minutes later, you still have to bring it back all the way to wherever our shop may be. So that would be the first step, is you come in and you get it reset. And from there, how the Ignition Interlock provider handles it as far as payment goes will be a little bit different. Like at ALCOLOCK, we choose to not charge people a violation reset fee if you pass 5 minutes later, because that shows us that you hadn't actually been drinking. But at that point, anytime someone comes in to get their device reset, at the end of that day, it automatically gets sent over to the DMV. That data does. And there tends to be a lot of confusion as to, what do we decide to report to the DMV, what gets reported to the DMV. It comes down to everything gets reported to the DMV. The DMV has a backdoor access to every service provider's program. So they can go in and see the log reports for everything at any time. And just at the end of the day, every calibration that we do, every reset we do all that data just gets dumped into a DMV database at the end of that day.
So on that same line, in terms of any additional information that you all are entering, if the client comes in, has their vehicle serviced, and they kind of explain to you what happened, do you all pass that information along to the DMV in any way, or is it more they're just seeing there was a fail at X time of day? There was a pass 5 minutes later. Are they seeing anything beyond just what the log is reporting? Do you all make any type of internal notes?
So we have internal notes that we have in our program, but the program that they go into, they don't see that. What we do give to clients is anytime they come in for a violation, we'll give them a form with their log report of where the fail occurred. There's a section at the bottom where they can write in what happened. And at that point, that could get sent over to the DMV, but that is the client's words. I personally find it better if clients don't write anything in that.
Okay.
Just because I don't want someone to say something that could hint at an admission of guilt and not know it.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right.
I find it better for them to not write anything down that's going to get shown unless they consult with you guys first.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really helpful point of clarification then, because, there was, I had the mindset that there was possibly some information that could get communicated to a provider that would change what then is being shared with the DMV. So it really is just you all are really just passing along electronically the logs from the device, and there's not really any kind of explanation or anything that ALCOLOCK or Monitech or SmartStart is passing along to the DMV specifically.
No, unfortunately not. And it's always been that way. It's been very, I guess, like one-sided. All we do is we're just kind of a middleman. Clients come in, we take that data, download it, and then just send it over to them. And the DMV from that point, and I guess we'll get to that in a second, like how they decide what violations are worthy of a hearing, they'll make that determination on that end. We're not probation. We do not make any decisions as far as what gets reported, what doesn't, who loses their license, who comes in for a hearing. That's all on the DMV's end of it.
Yeah, so let's move into that direction then. What does that look like in terms of the DMV deciding what reports to act on?
So the DMV is a mystery to a lot of people.
They definitely are. Yeah, it's the whole 8-month timeline is just like what's going on behind the scenes. Why is this taking such a long time?
So if you were to kind of look into the budget, how the DMV operates themselves, there's an Ignition Interlock department within the DMV. And I think right now there's about 9 or 10 staff members who work in that, but it'll adjust based on the annual budget. So sometimes they're severely underfunded. Other times they may have more funding. And in my experience, anecdotally, that wait time oftentimes is dependent on how many staff members they have. But after a violation, that data gets sent to the DMV, and then an automated program will send up a red flag. Hey, a violation occurred here. And then from there, a DMV hearing officer for their region, and, the state is split up into regions, and there's DMV hearing officers who work a certain region. The DMV hearing officer for that region goes through it themselves, and then they will decide, okay, this person should come in for a hearing. This violation, they don't need to come in for a hearing. So that's why knowing who your DMV hearing officer is for your region is super, super important, because they're all very, very different. I've seen some hearing officers who require 3 people come in. I've seen other hearing officers who don't want 3 people to come in. Some hearing officers won't allow the attorney to come in. I've heard that before. And then as far as what each hearing officer deems worthy of a hearing is very specific to that hearing officer. There tends to be kind of like the old guard hearing officers who've been doing it a very long time, and there's some newer ones here lately, and they tend to have different ideologies per se. Ones who have been doing it a really long time, they're really hard, very, I guess, AA minded, if that were to make sense.
Right.
And you just kind of have to be like cognizant of that. Anecdotally, test you fail trying to start your car they don't give you as much trouble for. A skipped test, they don't tend to, that's usually not a reason to call someone in. It's test you fail while you're driving.
Right.
That really seems to be like kind of what gets them going. But as far as topical fails, if someone passes 5 minutes later, I used to say with more confidence that they didn't call people in if you passed 5 minutes later. The more I do it, that doesn't always seem to be the case. And I do feel that it falls a lot on who that specific individual hearing officer is.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to kind of have some understanding of what that looks like. Do you have any insight into weighing that particular fail against past history and how that's taken into account? If somebody hasn't ever had a fail for 4 months, does that kind of, or if they have 3 or 4, fails that are, initial fail at point of starting the vehicle, and then 5 minutes later they're passing, but it's now happened multiple times. Do you have any thoughts on how kind of the person's prior history from past months of interlock use plays into that?
And this is all anecdotal. In my experience, it only weighs into it at the actual hearing when the decision is made to take their license or not. When it comes to initially the hearing officer gets that report and makes that decision, I'm going to make this person come in for a hearing. I don't believe prior history has much to do with it, because they're just looking at that one little report of just what happened within about a 20-minute increment of time. When it comes to the hearing and kind of preparing for that hearing, really important to make sure you get those log reports to see exactly what that hearing officer is going to see, and not just getting the log report, but understanding what's in that log report. Unit malfunctions, they do occur. I helped one attorney out of Winston with their hearing because the provider that they were using, they didn't quite understand the terminology in the log report, but it essentially said that the unit's pump was malfunctioning. So they failed a test, and then there was a pump malfunction error, and they failed the follow-up test. But because that pump malfunction occurred between the initial and the second failed test, if the pump was malfunctioning, it may not have pumped out that previously failed breath sample. So the first initial fail could have been impacting that second test. And they ended up winning the hearing based on that, just by reviewing that log report.
Gotcha. Yeah. And in terms of those log reports, when you get a notice from the DMV that you have failed and that you have the ability to request a hearing, and here's how to do that, here's your time frame for requesting a hearing, most of the time, or I think the letters that are sent, they don't indicate the specific date that is in question in terms of when the fail was. Do you all have the ability on your end to see what the DMV is looking at in terms of what date specifically is going to be at issue in the hearing? Do you have any indication of that, or is it a matter of just contacting the DMV specifically to figure out what date is at issue?
We don't have any indication of it because, like I said, the DMV has a backdoor into our program, but as of right now, there is no integration of the systems.
Okay.
We're working on that now. Hopefully in about a year and a half, we will have the ability to go into a part of the DMV system and see, does someone have an active license? How many vehicles do they have? And things like that. But right now we don't. So it really is a matter of just calling into the DMV. But I've heard of instances where people call into the DMV and they can't get an exact answer. And they really don't find out till they go to their first initial hearing.
Yeah, that's been something that, we've tried to avoid that situation by reaching out to the hearing officer ahead of time. So again, going to your point of like knowing who your hearing officer is and having a relationship with them, that's been very critical, because there have been several times in my practice where, I thought that the DMV hearing was going to be about, a fail that happened on, May 15th, go to the DMV and find out, no, they're actually looking at a totally different date, had to get a continuance and kind of find, other logs that were kind of further back in time. And so really that's one of the first things that I try to do whenever we get that letter from the DMV and request the hearing, is to make sure that we're actually kind of going to be addressing the right specific date, because I've also found that in hearing experience, the DMV does not really kind of look at multiple dates at any one given hearing typically. So if they, issue the letter based on a violation that happened on May 30th, they're typically going to kind of have that address, that's what they're going to address at the hearing. They're not going to address, the violation that happened on January 15th or on July 17th. Again, verify that with your hearing officer beforehand, but for the most part, they're going to just focus on the date that was the reason for the letter going out in the first place. I guess in terms of the time frame for getting that information passed over to the DMV, you kind of mentioned that when somebody comes in with a fail notice and they get their device kind of recalibrated or reset at that point, information goes off to the DMV at the end of the day. Is that true also when somebody comes in for their kind of regular, every 2-month servicing, that they,
Yes.
that information just goes out that evening or whatnot?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. Anytime someone comes in and we touch someone's unit, and every time someone comes in, we calibrate it to make sure it's accurate, and then we will download the data and send it to the DMV. Anytime we touch the unit, that data is going to get sent to the DMV. We don't have the authority to have any discretion as far as what gets sent and what does not. So it's just literally everything goes.
And then I guess maybe final question that I have for you is in terms of getting copies of your records, related to the logs from the Ignition Interlock device. Is that something that you can get from your interlock provider, and kind of generally how do you go about getting your logs?
So I have all of our attorney partners call me directly. And the reason that is, anyone who's tried to get log reports before, if you've called a 1-800 number, I'm sure you've had trouble getting them at some point. I understand the need to get them right away. So we personally guarantee that you're going to get it within 24 hours. We just have people call me directly. We do have a 1-800 number that you can call, where you can go online to our website and submit an online submission for it. But it's usually best, if you're going to recommend an interlock provider, any provider that your clients use, you really should have a direct contact at that interlock provider. So we've had instances, I've just heard of cases where an attorney, the night before the hearing, they still haven't gotten it. And this isn't the only case that you guys are working on. You've got a whole client load. So when you request it, you expect to get it, right, at some point. So it's usually best if you know someone directly working with the provider to get it to you, but you can just reach out to them via their call center. I'm not sure if every company has an online portal to go to. There's not an online portal for you to log in and see your client stuff. It's more just like sending a message like, hey, could I get these reports? But those reports, again, are the single most important thing that, any attorney can make sure they have before they walk into that hearing.
Great. Well, no, I appreciate very much, Jacob, all the information today. I really think that it's been valuable. It's one of the most difficult things, I think, to prepare for related to DWI services is an Ignition Interlock violation hearing, because of so many unknowns and a lot of mystery to it. So thank you for clearing up a lot of that mystery for us.
Absolutely. My number is 919-480-7836. I don't know if you can put it in a link. But even if clients don't have ALCOLOCK, if they have SmartStar, they have Monitech, everyone's bound by the same regulations and procedures. It's all going to be the same. So I tell everyone, feel free to reach out to me, even if you're working with a different provider. Having a second set of eyes on the technical aspects of the log is always really helpful.
That's great. Yeah, appreciate it very much. Hope you enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. If you did, please share the podcast with another freedom fighter in the criminal defense community, and be sure to leave us a rating on iTunes. See you next time.